A Gaza flotilla gets stopped in international waters. Activists are humiliated on camera. Trump talks like a war deadline is a clock ticking down, and the world's biggest powers are still arguing over pipelines, missile shields, and sea lanes. The headlines look scattered. The power moves do not. Today's rundown ties together several stories that are being treated like separate events, even though they all point to the same deeper pattern: pressure, performance, and escalation sold as necessity. We'll break down what the articles actually say about the Gaza flotilla, the widening Iran crisis, the fighting in Lebanon, the Putin-Xi summit, and the new Cuba indictment. Then we'll compare the official version with the parts that keep getting skipped over. If this kind of breakdown is useful, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Start with the flotilla story, because this is where the gap between official language and human reality is easiest to see. The basic facts are straightforward. More than 50 boats sailed from Turkey carrying activists from over 40 countries. The flotilla says it had food, baby formula, and medical aid intended for Palestinians in Gaza. Israel says the mission was a publicity stunt, claims the aid was token level, and argues it had every right to stop the boats because of the maritime blockade. Then came the interceptions. Israeli naval commando stopped the fleet in international waters west of Cyprus, far from Gaza itself. The organizers say some boats were rammed, some were hit with water cannon, and 6 came under fire. Israel says no live ammunition was used and insists it acted lawfully. That's the legal argument. But the story that actually sparked outrage was something else. A video posted by Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's far-right national security minister, showing himself taunting detained activists. He stood over handcuffed people, waved a flag, and told them, "We are the masters." That line matters because it doesn't sound like a security operation. It sounds like a message.
Italy, France, and Canada all condemned the treatment. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even distanced himself from Ben-Gvir, saying the behavior was not in line with Israel's values and ordering the activists deported. That's unusual. When your own prime minister feels forced to rebuke a cabinet minister on video, you know the optics became impossible to defend. But here's the part many reports glide past. The flotilla's purpose was never just to deliver aid, it was to force a confrontation with the blockade itself, and in that sense, it succeeded. The real question is whether stopping a symbolic convoy in international waters, then humiliating the participants on camera, actually helps Israel make its case. For supporters of the blockade, the answer is obvious. They see a security perimeter, a Hamas-linked challenge, and foreign activists playing politics. For critics, the footage is the point. If a government feels the need to publicly demean unarmed detainees, that usually means it's trying to project dominance beyond the law. And that is where the mainstream framing often falls short. It reports the diplomatic backlash, quotes the condemnations, then moves on. What it rarely lingers on is the deeper contradiction. If Gaza is supposedly flooded with aid, as Israel's foreign ministry claims, why do humanitarian groups, the UN, and flotilla organizers keep describing severe shortages, damaged infrastructure, and basic services that still barely function? The UN says families are still in overcrowded tents or damaged buildings, with shaky water access, poor waste management, pests, and shortages of fuel and spare parts. So when officials say the territory is receiving enough assistance, they are not just describing facts differently, they are describing a different reality entirely. And once you see that, the flotilla stops being a side story. It becomes a symbol of the whole information war around Gaza. One side says blockade equals protection, the other says blockade equals strangulation, and the public is left trying to decide which version is being packaged more neatly than it is being proved. Now shift to Iran, because this is where the entire story gets bigger, faster, and a lot more dangerous.
Trump says he's in no hurry to reach a deal, but in the same breath, he's given Iran 2 to 3 days to come up with one. That contradiction is the whole game. It sounds measured on the surface, but it functions like an ultimatum. J.D. Vance says there's been a lot of progress in talks, while Iran says the Middle East war would spread far beyond the region if attacks resume. Those are not just talking points, they're signals. At the same time, Iran says it coordinated the passage of 26 vessels through the Strait of Hormuz in 24 hours. That matters because the strait is the pressure point for global energy. Before the war, a huge share of the world's oil shipments moved through there. Since the confrontation escalated, traffic has been disrupted, the U.S. has blockaded Iranian ports, and shipping is being turned into leverage. The Food and Agriculture Organization has already warned that this could become a global food price shock, not just an oil issue. That's the part governments always downplay until it hits consumers. When fuel and fertilizer move, food follows. When shipping costs climb, retail prices climb. When a choke point becomes a battlefield, everyone downstream pays. And while all of that is happening, the Senate is trying to use a war powers resolution to rein in Trump's military campaign. The vote advanced 50 to 47, with a handful of Republicans joining Democrats. That's not a final victory, but it's a sign that even inside Washington, there's growing discomfort with how casually the administration treats the constitutional limits on war. The White House, of course, is looking for loopholes. NBC says the Pentagon may even rename the operation from Epic Fury to Sledgehammer, which sounds ridiculous until you remember the reason. Renaming a war can be used to pretend the legal clock restarted. That's not strategy, that's paperwork dressed up as statecraft.
And that's why this whole episode should concern anyone who cares about restraint, not just anyone who dislikes one party or another. The public is being told there's a narrow diplomatic path, while the military pressure keeps continuing in the background. Shipments are blocked, sanctions are piled on, attacks continue, and officials talk as if the issue is merely whether a deal appears in time.
Maybe that's why the language gets so theatrical. Trump says, big hit. Iran says the conflict will widen. US officials talk about progress. In practice, every side seems to think more pressure will create leverage. That's the problem. Once each side assumes economic pain will force the other to blink, you get a conflict that can keep grinding without a clear off-ramp. And because the consequences are scattered through fuel prices, food prices, and shipping insurance, the people absorbing the damage are often the least consulted. Meanwhile, the war that was supposed to be contained is still chewing through Lebanon and Gaza. In southern Lebanon, Israeli strikes killed at least 12 more people on Wednesday, including people in homes, near a hospital, and on a motorcycle. Lebanese officials say more than 3,000 people have been killed since the invasion began, with nearly 10,000 wounded. Even with ceasefire extensions on paper, the strikes continue. That disconnect is important. A ceasefire that still allows repeated airstrikes starts to look less like peace and more like a pause in public messaging. If civilians are still dying, the distinction between active war and managed conflict begins to feel artificial. The Israeli military has usually framed these attacks as targeting Hezbollah, but when women, children, and other civilians make up a significant share of the dead, that claim becomes harder to square with the casualty lists. It doesn't mean every strike is indiscriminate. It does mean the official explanation often sounds cleaner than the battlefield does. Gaza tells the same story in a different register. Israel says aid is flowing in large quantities. Humanitarian groups say conditions remain dire, with families still living in damaged structures and tents, and basic infrastructure still broken. Both things can't be fully true at the same time. Either the aid system is not working as claimed, or the operational definitions are so loose they no longer match real conditions on the ground.
There is another layer that gets missed in coverage. Humanitarian access is not just about the amount of aid approved. It's about whether equipment, fuel, generators, spare parts, water systems, and logistics can actually function after they cross the border. A truckload of food doesn't restore a crippled water line. A pallet of medical supplies doesn't fix a destroyed power grid. So when officials boast about tonnage, they're often answering a different question than the one civilians are living with. And this is where the coverage can become almost emotionally anesthetized. One article says a strike hit a home in southern Lebanon. Another says the flotilla was blocked. Another says Gaza is receiving massive amounts of assistance. Read together, they tell a story of a region where force is normalized so thoroughly that the administrative language starts to hide the violence instead of describing it. That's why the important question isn't only whether a ceasefire exists, it's whether any of the parties involved actually believe that a ceasefire means stopping the machinery of war. Now zoom out, because the same pattern shows up again in the great power headlines and even in US domestic politics. Putin and Xi met in Beijing with all the symbolism you'd expect: red carpet, orchestral flourishes, warm language, and public praise for friendship and trust. But the reporting makes a useful point that gets lost in the usual bromance talk. These are not soulmates. They are states with overlapping interests and plenty of mistrust. Russia wants the power of Siberia 2 pipeline. China is not rushing. Russia wants partnership. China wants leverage. That's geopolitics in one sentence. The display is meant to signal unity against the United States, especially after Trump's Golden Dome missile defense plan drew joint condemnation from Moscow and Beijing as a threat to strategic stability. But underneath the ceremony is a practical truth. Even countries that look aligned on camera are constantly bargaining over price, dependence, and autonomy. That matters because it's the exact opposite of how governments usually talk about alliances. They sell them like family. They operate them like contracts.
Cuba fits the same pattern from another angle. The U.S. Justice Department just indicted Raul Castro over the 1996 shoot-down of civilian planes. On paper, this is about accountability for a long-past incident. In context, it looks more like another pressure lever in a broader campaign against Havana. Some analysts see it as legal follow-through. Others see a deliberate escalation, times to fit the administration's larger posture toward Cuba, especially as Washington is also revisiting allegations of drones, asymmetric warfare, and regime pressure. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Old cases become new weapons when governments need more leverage. And then there's Thomas Massey's primary loss in Kentucky, which says a lot about domestic politics. Massey was one of the few Republicans willing to challenge foreign aid to Israel and question the power of donor networks tied to that issue. He lost after a flood of spending, a Trump endorsement against him, and heavy intervention from pro-Israel groups. You don't have to overstate that race to understand what it represents. It showed how expensive and disciplined the machinery around foreign policy can be when a sitting member starts saying no. It also exposed a growing discomfort among voters who increasingly notice when a local election turns into a referendum on foreign influence, not local priorities. That's the part many national outlets won't say directly. Americans are being asked to treat endless foreign commitments as normal, while their own costs, their own debt, and their own constitutional checks get pushed aside. The public is expected to applaud toughness abroad while accepting drift at home. And that bargain is wearing thin. So the big picture today is this. The flotilla story exposed the gap between blockade enforcement and human dignity. The Iran crisis is still being managed through threats, blockades, and legal workarounds. Lebanon and Gaza show that ceasefire can be a very flexible word. And the great power and Cuba stories reveal how often diplomacy is just pressure in better clothing. The common thread is simple. Governments keep asking the public to trust the official framing, even when the facts on the ground tell a messier story.
If you want more breakdowns like this, like the video, subscribe to Daily News, and drop a comment with which story you think the media is still underplaying.
Tomorrow's recap is going to dig into the next move in the Iran standoff and why it may matter far beyond the Middle East.